Hello, I'm Pastor Baz, and welcome to yet another edition of Roots and Redemption, the place where we speak about all things cultural. Let's talk about Zimbabwe, let's talk about Southern Africa, and let's discuss Christianity as we begin to try and understand our distinct heritage as Africans, but more importantly, as followers of Jesus Christ. And today's episode, episode 3, if you haven't checked out the first 2 episodes, please go on the links that I will post below and you can check out the first 2 episodes. But today, we want to look further into those biblical threads in African traditions and the legacy of the Rozvi Empire and see the space that we can uncover the rich spiritual heritage of Africa before the colonial footprints and trace how divine truth has been echoes of biblical traditions within the heart of Southern Africa itself. So today's episode, if you are one for titles, for me, speaks of ancient echoes, biblical threads in African traditions, and the legacy of the Rozvi Empire. So let's journey to the stone citadel of Great Zimbabwe, the seat of the Rozvi Empire, a civilization that once stood as a beacon of African ingenuity, trade, and spiritual depth. So we want to talk about animal sacrifice today. A shared ritual, one of the most fascinating parallels between African traditional religions and the Old Testament is the ritual of animal sacrifice. And among the Rozvi and other Shona-speaking groups, animal sacrifice was offered to Mwari, the supreme god, through mediums and ancestral intercessors. And these offerings were often made to bring rain, for healing, for forgiveness. Now listen to this. Doesn't this ring a bell? In Leviticus, we see the Israelites offering bulls, rams, and goats to Yahweh for atonement, for thanksgiving, and covenant sealing. And I have with me today an expert from the writings of a historian called Mark, who in 1972 describes this incident that he witnessed whilst he was at Great Zimbabwe during the reign of the Rozvi Empire. And he says, quote, in 1972, a spirit medium from the Nemanwa clan shared with Mark a sacrificial ritual performed after the harvest to Mwari, possibly during the 1820s. The ceremony, which was held in intervals of 2 to 4 years, was led by a high priest. And that's the kind of language that he actually uses, is the high priest. During these intervals, the Rozvi overlords of the countries hosted a post-harvest ceremony, which could be considered a thanksgiving ritual. A high priest led a procession to the top of the Zimbabwe hill known as Narire ya Mambo. The priest, who then enters the cave, offers a prayer and pours beers as part of the ritual. Meanwhile, the attending crowd will sing and clap their hands in rhythm of the ceremony. So March describes how in 1871, a heifer and 2 oxen were sacrificed. The heifer was burnt alive at the top of the hill, and 1 ox was slaughtered and eaten by the attendees, and the other ox was killed at the base of the hill and left for the wild animals to consume. And it has been suggested that Mark's description provides evidence of an annual ritual held at Great Zimbabwe, often after the harvest, in honor of Mwari, known as the Bira. So during Bira ceremonies, millet beer was consumed, and of course the spirit is encouraged to possess the medium through the rhythms of drumming and dancing, and some of the stuff I'm talking about you know about. But listen, how many of us today have ever heard of burnt offerings offered up to a god? I bet you've heard of burnt offerings in the context of biblical history, of Jewish religious history, but you haven't heard much of our people, our Shona people, offering up burnt offerings. But there is evidence, history tells us, that at Great Zimbabwe, they, led by someone who stood in the position of a priest, of a high priest, they offered burnt sacrifices, a burnt offering on top of the hill to their god, who they knew as Nwari. Now, of course, you could continue to say, oh, well, these are traditions that are coincidental. But I believe, as we will explore further, you will see that there is more likely a connection of the intermingling of ancient Judaism and culture right down to Southern Africa that informs what our culture is today. So we know our people used to do burnt offerings, uh, just like they were done in the Old Testament. And in Leviticus, we see the Israelites offering bulls, rams, goats to Yahweh for atonement, for thanksgiving, and covenant sealing. So sacrifice wasn't just something that was a ritual. It was a deeply spiritual transaction, a bridge between the seen and unseen. An interesting fact, in many African traditions, blood was not taken lightly either. It symbolized life and covenant, just like in the Bible. From the blood of the Hebrew doorpost in Egypt to Jesus' words at the Last Supper, blood sealed divine agreements. Could it be that these rituals in Africa weren't simply pagan customs, but distant echoes of a once shared ancient spiritual memory? And look, the gold of affair that is described in the Bible. Oh, this is one subject I'm keen and excited to talk about. Right, so let's talk geography and prophecy. The Save River, also known as the Sabe River, flows through the southeastern parts of Zimbabwe and Mozambique. And historical lore and archaeological findings suggest that this region might have been part of the ancient biblical land of Ophir, a place famous for its gold, ivory, and exotic treasures. And according to First Kings chapter 10, 11, and Second Chronicles chapter 9, the ships of Solomon brought back the gold from Ophir. And who else is mentioned in this golden narrative? The Queen of Sheba, who visited King Solomon bearing gifts, including very much gold. So some scholars and African historians propose a theory that ancient trade routes between Middle East and Southern Africa were active far before colonial intervention. If so, the Middle Eastern culture, including these early Judaic thoughts, could have filtered into Southern Africa centuries before missionaries arrived. In fact, we know that they did. Could it be that these ancient African empires were already engaging with divine truths long before Bibles were shipped in by missionaries many centuries later? Sub-Saharan echoes of biblical practice. Let's look beyond Zimbabwe for a moment, and we can even see that in West Africa, the Akan people have a belief in Nyame, the supreme god who is above all other gods, a structure similarly to Jewish monotheism. The Igbo of Nigeria, we've spoken about before, and they believe in the Most High gods, and their oral traditions all have echoes of the Ten Commandments. And among the Zulu, of course, we know that there is this idea of the ancestors being a great cloud of witnesses. And I know that idea, that worldview is ubiquitous in African cultures. And we also see that same concept in Hebrews chapter 12, which describes those who have gone before as a great cloud of witnesses. And even circumcision is a rite found in Jewish tradition and is practiced by several African communities as a spiritual initiation into manhood and covenant. And interesting to note that some Ethiopian and Eritrean tribes claim direct descent from the union between King Solomon and Queen Sheba. And in fact, the Kebra Nagast, an Ethiopian manuscript, documents this royal encounter and the birth of Menelik I, the first, said to be founder of the Solomonic dynasty. Redemption and roots. What does this mean for us today? It means that African spirituality was never a tabla rasa, like they always say. It was never a blank slate waiting for missionaries to write on. It was a canvas painted with divine fingerprints, ready for the revelation of Christ to complete the picture. And Africa's encounter with Christianity wasn't a colonial invention, it was a reunion, a return to the truths long whispered among our ancestors. I'll let that sink in for a while I drink some water. And so, as you walk this, your spiritual journey, let's remember as Africans that our faith has African fingerprints. And sometimes we callously castigate everything that is African because we've become Christians. And just talking on a cultural point of view, our culture does have in it the influences, obviously, of the people that we interacted with in our past. And we did interact with people from the Middle East. We did interact with Jews. We interacted with many other peoples. And they rubbed off on us as much as we rubbed off on them. And so what later on ensued and took place as we formulated what our traditions are, what our beliefs are, was the combination of a lot of our experiences. And some of those experiences were with Christianity, were with Christians, were with Judaism, were with Jews. And the evidence is strongly before us. So I think as we look at this, my point of roots and redemption is we can redeem our history from the language of colonization. The language of colonization that sees a gaping chasm between ourselves and the Bible and the life of the Bible, the traditions of the Bible, and the people of the Bible. And I believe that chasm is a chasm that has been created by our experience with colonization. And it has given us the wrong matrix from which to operate when looking at the Christian religion. And so as we continue to have these conversations, like I promised you before, we're going to have back and forth. If you have questions and suggestions, please include those in the comments below. Please don't forget to like and subscribe and share this episode with a fellow truth seeker so that we can begin to help each other as African people who are Christian people. This journey at Roots and Redemption is not a journey back to our Africanness. We are already African. It's a journey to reunite with our Christian roots. Christianity is not an enemy of Africans. Certainly, Christian traditions and worldviews are not enemies of African worldviews. In fact, there is a lot of relationship. And I feel a lot of people, once they know this truth, will be able to accept and receive the gospel freely without feeling like they're selling out their Africanness, like the narrative that dominates would like you to believe. So until next time, please continue following and supporting Roots and Redemption, and hopefully God will give us the opportunity to have more wonderful conversations about this great heritage that we have of being Christians, first of all, and followers of Jesus Christ, but also being Africans.